Daniel Cross had learned to read a room in under 3 seconds. Boardrooms, hostile negotiations, press conferences, where every question was a trap dressed up as curiosity. He could walk into any of them and know exactly where the danger was sitting. But nothing had prepared him for the particular danger of a 6-year-old refusing to eat her chicken tenders in a diner that, as far as anyone here knew, he had absolutely nothing to do with. "Lily, one bite. Just one, and then we can talk about the ice cream," he said, keeping his voice low the way he did in meetings when he wanted people to lean in rather than push back. Lily crossed her arms and stared at the plate like it had personally wronged her. The baseball cap pulled low over his forehead was starting to feel less like a disguise and more like a headache, and the fluorescent lights buzzing above table 6 were doing nothing for the exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 11 days. Not since the board meeting, where 3 separate department heads had reported the same thing in 3 different ways. Customer satisfaction scores were falling at the flagship diners, quietly but steadily, and nobody in a glass office 40 floors up could explain why. So here he was, in jeans that cost less than his usual tie, sitting in a corner booth of the very restaurant chain that bore his family's fortune, trying to see with his own eyes what his customers saw every single day. What he was seeing at the moment was a man 2 booths over, glancing at him and Lily with unmistakable disdain, the kind reserved for people assumed to be scraping by. The man muttered something to his companion about people bringing their kids out to eat when they clearly couldn't afford it, loud enough to carry across the aisle, and Daniel felt his jaw tighten with an old, familiar heat, the kind he used to feel in boardrooms before he trained himself to bury it under composure. He told himself it didn't matter what a stranger thought of a man in a worn jacket and a diner booth, that Daniel Cross, the CEO, was safely locked away in a tower of glass and steel 40 minutes from here, untouched by whatever this stranger believed about him. But the word still landed somewhere soft, somewhere that had nothing to do with his net worth and everything to do with the tired, ordinary father, trying to get his daughter to eat dinner after a day that had already asked too much of both of them. He was ready to let it go the way he let 100 small cruelties go every week, because responding cost more than it was worth, and because Lily was watching him the way children always watch their parents in moments of quiet conflict, absorbing the lesson before they understand they're learning one. But before he could decide anything, the cashier working the counter, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a low knot and a name tag that read Raina, set down the rag she'd been using to wipe the counter, walked directly to the man's table and said something Daniel couldn't hear over the clatter of the kitchen. Whatever it was, it made the man's face flush an ugly shade of red, and he grabbed his check and dropped a crumpled bill on the table without waiting for change, muttering under his breath as he hustled his companion toward the door. Raina didn't gloat. She didn't even look particularly satisfied with herself. She simply walked back behind the register like nothing had happened, straightened a stack of napkins that didn't need straightening, and went on with her shift as though defending strangers from casual cruelty was simply part of the job description nobody had bothered to write down. Daniel watched her for a long moment, something shifting quietly in his chest. Some old, rusted gear turning for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit. Lily, blissfully oblivious to the small drama unfolding around her, had finally picked up a single chicken tender and was inspecting it with deep suspicion, as though it might still be betraying her. A few minutes later, Raina appeared at their table with a small paper cup of apple slices, setting it down in front of Lily without being asked. "I noticed she wasn't touching the tenders," Raina said, crouching slightly so she was closer to Lily's eye level, her voice dropping into the particular gentleness adults use only with children they actually like. "Sometimes the crunchy stuff just isn't the mood. Apples are less of a commitment." Lily eyed the cup, then eyed Raina, then reached for a slice with the careful testing motion of a child deciding whether to trust a stranger. Daniel opened his mouth to say they hadn't ordered that, some automatic executive reflex kicking in about proper accounting and not accepting things he hadn't budgeted for, a habit so deeply ingrained he sometimes hated himself for it. But Raina beat him to it. "It's on the house," she said, straightening up. "New menu items get comped for kids this week anyway. Company policy." It wasn't company policy. Daniel knew every line of every current promotion because he had personally approved the marketing calendar 3 weeks earlier, sitting in a conference room with people who called him Sir and avoided eye contact. There was no such offer anywhere in that calendar. She was lying, gently, generously, to spare a stranger the awkwardness of gratitude he clearly didn't want to perform in public. He looked up at her properly for the first time, and something about the directness in her eyes unsettled him in a way he couldn't yet name. "That's kind of you," he said carefully. "But you don't have to do that." "I know," Raina said, and there was no performance in it, no fishing for a bigger tip or a manager's praise, just a flat, unembarrassed honesty. "I want to. That guy back there was a jerk, and your daughter's having a rough night, and it costs the restaurant about 40 cents to make somebody's night slightly less rough. Seems like a fair trade to me." She said it plainly, like she was stating a fact about the weather. And then she turned and walked back to the register before he could respond, already calling out a greeting to the next customer in line. Daniel found himself watching her hands as she rang up the order, quick and precise, no wasted movement, the kind of controlled efficiency he usually only saw in people who had once worked somewhere with far higher stakes than a diner register. It nagged at him, a splinter of curiosity he didn't have room for tonight. And yet there it was anyway, lodged somewhere he couldn't easily shake it loose from. Lily, encouraged by the apples, finally took a bite of a chicken tender and declared with the solemnity of a queen granting a pardon that it was actually okay. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and allowed himself for just a moment to feel like an ordinary father having an ordinary dinner, instead of a man who had spent the last 2 years quietly rebuilding both a company and a little girl's entire world after losing his wife in an accident that still visited him some nights in dreams he never described to anyone, not even his own therapist. The diner noise washed over him, comforting in its anonymity, clattering dishes, a couple arguing softly in a corner booth about someone's mother, the hiss of the soda fountain refilling, and for the length of one meal, nobody in this room needed anything from Daniel Cross except for him to pass the ketchup. And there was a strange mercy in that anonymity he hadn't expected to find here. His phone buzzed twice against his thigh, and he glanced down out of habit, the screen lighting up with his brother's name. Marcus. A text terse even by Marcus's standards. "Need you to sign off on the Q3 reallocation before Friday. Don't overthink it, just trust me on this one." Daniel felt the small, specific tension that any message from Marcus these days seemed to carry, a tightness at the base of his skull that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the particular way his younger brother had been avoiding his eyes in meetings lately, deflecting questions about departmental budgets with a practiced smoothness that Daniel, exhausted as he was, had chosen not to examine too closely. He typed back a short reply, "We'll talk Monday," and slid the phone face down on the table, unwilling to let Cross Hospitality Group follow him into the 1 hour of the week that still felt like his own. When it came time to pay, he approached the counter himself, leaving Lily coloring on a paper placemat with the crayons Raina had brought over earlier without being asked. Up close, Raina looked younger than he'd first guessed, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes that didn't quite match the brightness she kept in her voice for the customers. There was a thin white scar along one knuckle and a keychain clipped to her apron with a small brass compass charm that had clearly been through years of use, its edges worn smooth. "Rough night for you too, looks like," Daniel said, nodding toward the general chaos of the dinner rush, mostly to make conversation, though he wasn't entirely sure why he wanted to keep her talking. Raina shrugged as she counted his change into neat, practiced stacks. "Rough year, honestly. But you learn to compartmentalize when you've done corporate work." "Diner shifts are practically relaxing by comparison." The words came out before she seemed to fully register them. A flicker of something crossing her face. Regret, maybe, or wariness, as if she'd said more than she meant to say to a stranger buying dinner for his daughter. Daniel's curiosity sharpened into something closer to focus. "Corporate work," he repeated, keeping his tone light, unthreatening. The same tone he used when he wanted a nervous employee to keep talking instead of shutting down. "What kind?" "The kind I don't do anymore," Raina said a little too quickly, sliding his receipt across the counter with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Enjoy the rest of your night. Your daughter's got good taste in crayon colors, by the way. Purple's underrated." The deflection was smooth, practiced even, the kind of redirect Daniel had used himself 1,000 times in negotiations when he didn't want to reveal his hand. It told him almost nothing and everything at once. Somewhere behind that name tag and that apron was a story she didn't want strangers pulling at and against, every instinct telling him to mind his own business. Daniel found himself wanting to know what it was. As he gathered Lily's things and helped her into her jacket, fumbling with a zipper that always stuck halfway, he caught one more glimpse of Raina, now helping an elderly customer read the menu with unhurried patience. Her voice gentle in a way that felt entirely unlike a performance for tips. There was something in the careful, controlled way she moved through the world, like a person who had once had a great deal and had learned painfully how to need very little. Daniel didn't know her name beyond the tag on her chest. Didn't know a single real fact about her life. And yet, as he walked out into the parking lot with Lily's small hand in his, the cold night air doing nothing to clear the strange, persistent weight settling in his chest, he found himself already inventing an excuse to come back. The drive home took 18 minutes. And Lily spent most of it narrating an elaborate story about a purple dragon who ran a diner for other dragons, apparently inspired by the crayon and the evening's events in equal measure. Daniel listened with half his attention, making the right noises at the right moments, while the other half of his mind kept circling back to a woman he had known for less than 20 minutes and a single sentence she hadn't meant to say out loud. Corporate work. It could have meant anything. A marketing assistant, a low-level analyst, someone who'd simply burned out on cubicle life the way half the country seemed to have in recent years. But the precision in her hands at the register, the way she'd handled the confrontation with the rude customer without raising her voice or losing composure, the practiced deflection when he'd pressed even slightly, none of it matched the story of someone who'd merely gotten tired of spreadsheets. It matched something closer to a person who had been trained at some point to handle pressure and people at the same time, and who had since learned the hard way to be very careful about what she revealed to strangers. At home, after Lily was finally asleep, with the dragon story still half finished on her lips, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen island with a glass of water he didn't really want, his laptop open in front of him, though he hadn't typed a single word. He told himself he was reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Instead, he found his cursor hovering more than once over the internal employee directory he had full access to as CEO, his thumb resting against the trackpad. Some line he couldn't quite name, stopping him from typing a single letter of her name. It felt absurdly like something that should be earned in person rather than looked up in a database at midnight, though he couldn't have said why that mattered to a man who ran one of the largest hospitality companies on the East Coast and had never in his life hesitated to pull a personnel file when it served the business. He closed the laptop instead. The low hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house. And told himself he'd go back to the diner once more, just to be sure his read on the falling satisfaction scores was accurate. It was, he knew, even as he thought it, only half the truth. The second visit happened 4 days later, and Daniel told himself it was purely professional, the same way he'd told himself the first visit was purely professional. A lie that grew thinner each time he repeated it to the mirror while knotting a tie he wouldn't need until after he'd changed out of it in the parking garage 2 blocks from the diner. He came alone this time, no Lily in tow, arriving during the slower stretch of a Tuesday afternoon when the lunch rush had thinned to a handful of retirees nursing coffee and a delivery driver scrolling through his phone in a corner booth. Raina was there restocking napkin dispensers with the same unhurried efficiency he remembered, and something in his chest loosened slightly at the sight of her, an admission he wasn't ready to examine too closely. She glanced up as the bell over the door chimed, and recognition flickered across her face, before she schooled it into the professional neutrality of someone greeting a regular. "No sidekick today?" she asked, nodding toward the empty space beside him where a small daughter usually stood. "School," Daniel said, sliding onto a stool at the counter instead of taking a booth. A small, deliberate choice that put him closer to her register than strictly necessary. "She informed me this morning that missing kindergarten for diner food was, and I quote, not a good trade." Raina's mouth twitched into something that was almost a real smile, the first one he'd seen from her that wasn't manufactured for customer service. "Smart kid. Kindergarten's got glitter glue. We've got mystery meatloaf on Tuesdays." He ordered coffee he didn't particularly want, mostly as an excuse to stay at the counter longer than a normal customer would, and Raina poured it without comment, though he caught her eyes flicking toward him twice in the process. A quiet, assessing look that told him she'd clocked something unusual about his return visit, even if she wasn't ready to name it either. "You come back a lot for a guy who doesn't seem like the diner type," she said eventually, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, the closest thing to idle conversation she'd allowed herself with him. "What's the diner type?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious how she'd answer, and found himself leaning forward slightly to hear it. "Tired people. Broke people. People who don't want to cook and don't want to talk to anybody who knows their whole life story," Raina said, ticking the categories off with the ease of someone who'd spent real time cataloging her clientele. "You've got expensive shoes under those jeans, by the way. I noticed the first night. Diner people don't usually have shoes like that." Daniel felt something cold move through him, quick and sharp, an instinct honed by years of negotiations warning him that he'd been read more accurately than he'd intended. He kept his face neutral, the same expression he wore when a rival executive tried to bluff him across a boardroom table. "Good shoes were on sale," he said, which was, technically, not even a lie, since the shoes in question had in fact been part of a private designer sample sale his assistant had dragged him to 18 months ago. Raina studied him for a beat longer than was comfortable, something calculating behind her tired eyes, and then seemed to decide it wasn't her business, letting the topic drop with a small shrug that he suspected was more deliberate than casual. "So what's your excuse for coming back?" she asked instead, refilling his coffee, though he'd barely touched it. "The food's fine, not spectacular. You could get better coffee at the gas station on 5th. Daniel considered several answers, all of them true in fragments and false as a whole. He could have said he was doing market research, which was technically accurate. He could have said the diner reminded him of a version of his life before the company had swallowed most of his waking hours, which was also true. Instead, what came out was simpler and more honest than he'd planned. "You," he said. "I keep thinking about what you did with that guy on my first visit, and what you did with the apples. And I guess I wanted to see if it was a fluke, or if you're actually like that." Raina went still for a moment, the rag in her hand pausing mid-wipe against the counter, and something vulnerable crossed her expression before she covered it with a short laugh. "That's either the nicest or the strangest thing a customer said to me in months, and I genuinely can't decide which." "Can it be both?" Daniel asked. And this time her laugh was real quick and surprised out of her, like she hadn't expected to enjoy the conversation as much as she apparently was. They talked for nearly 20 minutes after that, longer than either of them probably intended, covering nothing especially significant. Her opinion on the diner's questionable jukebox selection, his admission that he'd never once beaten his daughter at checkers despite her being 6 years old, a fact Raina found more delightful than she should have. But underneath the easy banter, Daniel found himself watching for details, the way he watched financial reports for irregularities, small anomalies that didn't fit the picture she was presenting. She used the word leverage once in reference to negotiating a better shift schedule with her manager, and then seemed to catch herself glancing at him, as though checking whether he'd noticed the word choice. He had. She also mentioned almost offhandedly that she used to keep a planner color-coded by priority level, a habit she said she'd never quite managed to break, even though her current job required nothing more complex than remembering who ordered the extra pickles. Daniel filed each detail away without meaning to. The same instinct that had made him successful in business now turned uncomfortably toward a woman who clearly wanted to remain a mystery. Later that evening, back at Cross Hospitality Group's headquarters for a meeting he couldn't reschedule, Daniel found himself distracted through most of the presentation on regional expansion, his mind repeatedly drifting back to a counter-conversation about checkers and color-coded planners. Marcus was presenting his younger brother's voice, smooth and confident, as he walked the board through Q3 projections. But Daniel noticed something he might have missed a month earlier, had he not spent the last several days paying closer attention to small inconsistencies. Marcus's numbers for the diner division's marketing spend didn't quite reconcile with what Daniel remembered approving personally. The discrepancy small enough to be an accounting error, but specific enough to needle at him. He made a mental note to have someone in finance pull the actual invoices rather than the summary Marcus had prepared, a decision that felt in the moment like ordinary due diligence, rather than anything more significant. After the meeting, Marcus lingered near the elevator, falling into step beside Daniel, with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed the approach. "You seem distracted lately," Marcus said, his tone light but his eyes doing something more careful, more watchful than the words suggested. "Everything okay with Lily? With the company?" Daniel considered his brother for a moment, noting the slight tightness around his mouth, the way his hands stayed in his pockets instead of gesturing the way they usually did when Marcus was relaxed. "Everything's fine," Daniel said. "Just tired." "Why, is something I should know about?" No, Marcus said a beat too quickly, the kind of denial that in any other context would have registered as a red flag, except Daniel's mind was elsewhere, still circling back to a diner counter and a woman who spoke like someone who used to run departments rather than register drawers. "Just checking in. Family looks out for family, right?" The words should have felt warm. Instead, something about the phrasing left a faint unease trailing behind Daniel as he walked to his car, though he couldn't have said exactly why, and he chalked it up to exhaustion rather than instinct, a mistake he would later recognize as one of many small failures to look closely enough at what was directly in front of him. Daniel's third visit to the diner came the following week, this time in the early evening when the dinner crowd was just beginning to build. He found Raina in the middle of an argument with a young man who'd apparently tried to walk out without paying her. Voice firm but controlled as she blocked his path to the door. Not aggressive, simply immovable, like a woman who had dealt with far worse than a $20 dine and dash. "I'm not calling the cops if you just pay for the burger," she said evenly. But I will if you make me chase you into the parking lot. And honestly, neither of us wants that kind of Tuesday. The young man, embarrassed and cornered, dug crumpled bills out of his pocket and shoved them at her before slinking out the door with what dignity he could salvage. Raina exhaled, smoothed her apron, and caught Daniel watching from near the entrance, his expression somewhere between admiration and concern. "Does that happen often?" he asked, approaching the counter as she rang the bills into the register. "Often enough that I've got a system," she said. "Corporate would probably prefer I just let people walk, less liability, easier paperwork. But somebody's got to actually give a damn about the bottom line at ground level, since it sure doesn't feel like anybody upstairs does." The comment landed harder than she likely intended, a small offhand criticism of the very company Daniel had built and now ran, and he felt the sting of it in a place he hadn't expected. An uncomfortable mirror held up to decisions he'd made from the safety of a corner office. Decisions about staffing levels and loss prevention policy that had always seemed reasonable on a spreadsheet. "You really think corporate doesn't care?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, genuinely wanting to know rather than defend. Raina considered the question seriously, more seriously than he expected, leaning against the counter with the particular weariness of someone who'd thought about this exact topic more than once during long, quiet shifts. "I think corporate cares about corporate," she said finally. "I think there's probably a CEO somewhere who means well in the abstract, who probably even believes he cares about people like me. But caring in the abstract doesn't do much when you're the one standing here at 11 at night with a stolen burger and no backup, you know. It's easy to care about people you've never had to actually look in the eye." She said it without particular venom, more resignation than anger. And Daniel found he had no immediate response, the words settling into him with an uncomfortable weight, because he was in this exact moment, looking her directly in the eye. And he was the CEO she was describing, and she had absolutely no idea. He left that night with more questions than he'd arrived with, and back in his home office, unable to sleep, he finally gave in to the impulse he'd been resisting for over a week. He opened the employee management portal, his fingers hovering again over the search field before he typed, slowly, deliberately, the letters of her name. Raina Cole. The system returned a single current record, hire date 8 months prior, position listed simply as Cashier, Diner, location 14, with an unremarkable employment history that gave him nothing beyond the basics. No red flags, no notes, nothing that explained the precision in her hands or the vocabulary of someone who'd once managed far more than a register drawer. But something made him keep searching, an itch he couldn't quite name, and he typed her name again, this time into the broader company archive search that predated the current HR system, the one reserved for legal and compliance records going back over a decade. The search bar blinked for a long moment before returning a result, and Daniel felt something in his stomach drop cold and sudden as a document loaded onto his screen. A termination file. A name that matched. A department he recognized instantly because it had reported directly to the executive floor 2 years earlier, back before a reorganization had quietly folded it into another division. He stared at the screen for a long time without moving. The coffee at the diner counter, and the color-coded planner, and the word leverage suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to see. And somewhere beneath the shock was a colder, more specific dread. Because at the bottom of the termination document, beside a line reading, "Approved by," was a signature he recognized immediately, in handwriting he'd know anywhere, because it was his own. Daniel sat with the termination document glowing on his screen for what felt like an hour, but was, according to the clock in the corner of his monitor, closer to 11 minutes. each one stretching longer than the last as he read and reread the details attached to Raina Cole's file. Senior Financial Analyst, Corporate Compliance Division. Terminated for cause following an internal investigation into falsified expense reporting. The language was clinical, bloodless, the kind of phrasing legal teams crafted specifically to protect the company from liability rather than to describe what had actually happened to a human being. He clicked through to the attached investigation summary, his stomach tightening further with each paragraph, because the more he read, the less the accusations against her seemed to match anything he'd witnessed in the diner over the past 2 weeks. The report claimed Raina had authorized a series of falsified vendor payments, totaling just under $200,000, funneled through shell accounts connected to a marketing subcontractor. It was precise, detailed, and utterly at odds with the woman who'd given a crying toddler free apple slices and chased down a dine-and-dash thief with nothing but sheer will and a raised voice. He scrolled further and found the digital signature authorizing her termination. His own name printed beneath a signature block he barely remembered signing, buried among dozens of similar approvals during a quarter when he'd been drowning in the aftermath of his wife's death, signing whatever HR and legal put in front of him because he simply hadn't had the capacity to interrogate every personnel decision that crossed his desk. It should have offered him some comfort, that distance, that context. Instead, it made him feel worse, because it meant he'd allowed someone's entire professional life to be dismantled without asking a single question, trusting a process he'd never bothered to verify. He pulled up the original investigation file, cross-referencing names, and found the signature of the internal auditor who'd flagged the discrepancies in the first place. Marcus Cross. His brother had initiated the investigation that ended Raina's career, and Daniel, exhausted and grieving, had rubber-stamped the outcome without ever reading past the executive summary. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen island until the sky outside began to lighten. Pulling every document he could access about the case, cross-referencing dates and account numbers with a focus he hadn't applied to anything outside of a major acquisition in years. The vendor accounts named in the investigation were unusual in a way that nagged at him progressively more the longer he stared at them. Oddly structured, oddly timed, disbursements that clustered suspiciously close to dates when Marcus himself had traveled internationally on what the company records listed as business development trips. Though Daniel now found himself wondering, with a discomfort that felt almost like betrayal, whether those trips had involved any actual business at all. He didn't have proof of anything, yet nothing beyond a pattern that could still technically be explained away by coincidence or incompetence rather than malice. But the pattern was there, and once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it, the way a single crack in a foundation becomes impossible to ignore once you've noticed it spreading. By morning, exhausted and unshaven, Daniel made a decision he knew was reckless even as he made it. He would not confront Marcus yet, not without more information. Not while there was still a chance he was wrong about his own brother. But he needed to see Raina again, needed to understand who she actually was beneath the careful, guarded version she presented at the counter. And he needed to do it before the guilt sitting in his chest metastasized into something he couldn't manage. He arrived at the diner that afternoon without Lily again, dressed in the same unremarkable clothes he'd worn every visit. Though today the disguise felt less like camouflage and more like a lie he was actively choosing to keep telling. Raina was behind the counter when he walked in, and something in her expression shifted slightly at the sight of him, a flicker of genuine warmth that made the weight in his chest heavier rather than lighter. "Third time's a pattern, not a coincidence," she said, sliding a coffee toward him before he'd even asked. A small gesture of familiarity that undid him more than he expected. "You're either developing a serious meatloaf addiction or there's something else going on." Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug, grateful for something to hold on to. "Maybe I just like the company," he said, which was true enough to be safe and vague enough to avoid the conversation he wasn't ready to have. Raina studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading people for a living. A skill she'd clearly carried with her from whatever life she'd had before this one.
"You look terrible, by the way," she said bluntly. "No offense. You look like a guy who hasn't slept and is trying really hard to pretend otherwise." "Rough week," Daniel admitted, which was, for once, the complete and honest truth.
They talked for a while longer than his previous visits, the conversation drifting into more personal territory than either of them had allowed before. Raina mentioned, in the careful, deflecting way she always did when the subject of her past came up, that she'd once had a job that chewed her up and spit her out, though she refused to elaborate beyond that, changing the subject with practiced ease whenever he pressed, even gently. Daniel found himself wanting badly to tell her everything he'd discovered the night before, to apologize for a signature he'd barely remembered signing, to somehow undo 2 years of damage with a single confession. But he also knew, with the clarity of someone who'd spent his career managing crises, that confessing now without proof, without a plan, without understanding the full scope of what Marcus might have done, would only make things worse. It would blow up any trust he built with her, expose an investigation before he had leverage to actually fix it, and possibly tip off his brother before Daniel had gathered enough evidence to hold him properly accountable. So instead, he sat with the guilt, silently hating himself a little more with every minute that passed, watching her laugh at something he'd said about Lily's ongoing dragon saga, knowing that laugh existed in spite of what his company, what he himself had done to her. It was nearly closing time when Raina reached beneath the counter to grab a fresh roll of receipt paper, and in the process, her elbow caught the strap of Daniel's jacket, which had slipped off the back of his stool and landed half open on the floor beside him. She bent automatically to pick it up, the reflexive courtesy of someone used to keeping a workspace tidy, and as she lifted the jacket, something slid partway out of the inner pocket. A slim leather badge holder that Daniel had forgotten was even in there. An old habit from years of moving quickly between headquarters and field visits without changing his coat. Raina's hand paused on the fabric, her eyes catching unmistakably on the corner of laminated plastic peeking out the Cross Hospitality Group logo embossed clearly across the top, his photograph visible just beneath it, along with a title that read in stark, unambiguous letters, Chief Executive Officer. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel watched the exact instant the color drained from her face, watched her expression cycle rapidly through confusion, then dawning recognition, then something colder and more guarded settling over her features like a door closing. She straightened slowly, the jacket still in her hands, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in years, genuinely afraid of what a person thought of him. "You're Daniel Cross," she said, her voice quiet but hard, each word deliberate as though she were testing the weight of the sentence before fully believing it herself. It wasn't a question. Daniel opened his mouth, searching for something, anything that might soften the moment, some explanation that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. "Raina, I can explain. You're the CEO," she said again, cutting him off, her voice rising slightly now, sharp enough that the elderly couple 2 booths away glanced over before quickly looking away, sensing the particular danger of a conversation not meant for public consumption. "You've been coming in here for 2 weeks, sitting at my counter, asking me about my life, eating apple slices with your daughter, and you're the actual CEO of the company that owns this diner." "I was doing customer research," Daniel said, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded, how inadequate, against the betrayal visibly spreading across her face. "I wanted to understand what was happening at the ground level, and I didn't think—" "You didn't think to mention it?" Raina interrupted, her voice now dangerously flat, the anger cooling into something colder and more controlled, which was, Daniel realized with a sinking feeling, far worse than shouting would have been. 2 weeks, Daniel. Multiple conversations. And you let me talk about hating corporate decisions I had no idea I was making, directly to the person who makes them. She set his jacket down on the counter with exaggerated care, as though handling something contaminated, and stepped back half a pace, putting distance between them that felt in the moment like it might as well have been a mile. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice quiet again now, but with an edge underneath it that hadn't been there before, something brittle and barely contained. "I have your money for the coffee. We're even. Please go." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to explain the discovery he'd made the night before, wanted to tell her that he knew about her termination, that he suspected something far worse than incompetence behind it, that he was in his own clumsy and cowardly way, trying to fix something before he understood how to fix it properly. But the look on her face told him clearly that nothing he said in this moment would land as anything other than another layer of manipulation from a man who had, in her eyes, been lying to her from the very first apple slice. He stood slowly, leaving a bill on the counter far larger than the coffee warranted, though he suspected she would refuse it the moment he was gone. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly, the truest thing he'd said all evening. "I know that doesn't fix anything right now, but I didn't." Raina didn't answer. She simply turned back to the register, her spine rigid, her hands trembling slightly as she busied herself with tasks that didn't need doing. And Daniel walked out into the cold evening air, carrying a weight far heavier than the one he'd walked in with, the shape of a decision he now had to make, pressing down on him with sudden, unbearable clarity. He could not undo the lie of the last 2 weeks, but he could, if he had the courage for it, finally uncover exactly what his own company, his own brother, and his own careless signature had done to the woman standing behind that counter. And this time, he would not look away from what he found. Daniel spent the 3 days following his exposure at the diner in a state of controlled, methodical fury, the kind he usually reserved for hostile takeovers and boardroom betrayals. Except this time, the target of his focus was his own brother. And the ground beneath that focus kept shifting the deeper he dug. He pulled every financial record connected to the vendor accounts named in Raina's termination file, cross-referencing them against travel logs, expense reports, and calendar entries going back 3 years, working late into the night in his home office with the door closed so Lily wouldn't wake and ask why her father looked like he hadn't slept in a week, which by that point, he essentially hadn't. The pattern he'd suspected on that first sleepless night sharpened into something undeniable the more he examined it. The shell vendor registered under a name so generic it had clearly been designed to avoid scrutiny, had received 11 separate payments over 14 months, each one authorized through a signature delegation that Marcus had quietly arranged 2 years earlier, ostensibly to streamline approvals during a period when Daniel had been consumed by grief and largely absent from day-to-day operations. The dates of the largest disbursements aligned almost perfectly with a series of unexplained gaps in Marcus's calendar blocks of time, marked simply as personal. And a discreet search through corporate card statements Daniel technically had every right to access revealed charges from 2 casinos in Atlantic City and 1 in Macau, charges Marcus had always quietly reimbursed to the company card before month-end reconciliation. A detail meticulous enough to avoid automatic flags, but not meticulous enough to survive someone actually looking. By the 3rd night, Daniel had assembled enough to know with a certainty that made him physically ill that his brother had embezzled funds through the shell vendor to cover gambling debts. And when internal audit flagged the discrepancy, Marcus had redirected the investigation toward Reyna, a mid-level compliance analyst who had, according to emails Daniel found buried in an old server backup, actually been the one to first notice the irregular vendor pattern and raise concerns through proper channels months before her own termination. She hadn't been the perpetrator. She had been the whistleblower, and Marcus had used his position, his access, and his brother's grief-addled inattention to bury her warning by making her the scapegoat instead. Daniel sat with that knowledge for a long time, the anger inside him curdling into something quieter and more dangerous, because it wasn't just professional malfeasance anymore. It was a betrayal that had cost an innocent woman her career, her reputation, and 2 years of her life. And Daniel's own signature sat at the bottom of the document that had done it. He didn't confront Marcus immediately. Instead, he spent a 4th day compiling everything into a single airtight file, working with a forensic accountant he trusted from outside the company, someone with no loyalty to the Cross family name and no reason to soften what the numbers actually showed. When the file was finally complete, Daniel called Marcus and asked him to come to the house that evening rather than the office, a choice he made deliberately, wanting this conversation to happen somewhere without the protective armor of executive titles and boardroom tables, somewhere closer to the truth of what they actually were to each other. Marcus arrived just after 8, wearing the same easy, confident smile he always wore, though something in his eyes tightened slightly the moment he stepped through the door and saw the folder waiting on the kitchen island. The same island where Daniel had spent so many recent nights unraveling exactly what that folder contained. "This feels ominous," Marcus said, attempting levity that didn't quite land in the heavy silence of the kitchen. "Should I be worried?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply slid the folder across the island and watched his brother's face as he opened it. Watched the practiced composure falter incrementally with each page. The casino statements, the shell vendor timeline, the whistleblower emails from Reyna Cole that predated her termination by months. Each document, another nail in an argument Marcus clearly hadn't expected his older brother to ever construct. "I can explain the accounts," Marcus started, but his voice had lost its usual confidence, the words coming out thinner than intended. "It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled in a way that felt more frightening than shouting would have. "You embezzled company funds to cover gambling debts, and when someone caught it, you buried her warning and let her take the fall instead of you. I signed her termination, Marcus. I trusted your investigation, and I signed it without reading past the summary because I was drowning that year, and you knew it, and you used that." Marcus's composure cracked fully then, the mask of easy charm sliding away to reveal something raw underneath, a desperation that had clearly been building for years under the surface of a man who had spent his entire life standing in his older brother's shadow. "You don't understand what it's like," Marcus said, his voice rising equal parts anger and something closer to grief. "Everyone in that building looks at you like you hung the moon, Daniel. Dad built this company, but everyone talks about you like you're the one who actually deserves it. And I'm just the guy who signs off on marketing budgets and gets invited to meetings. Nobody actually listens to me in. I made one mistake at the tables, and then another. And then I was so far underwater I didn't know how to get out, without everyone finding out I wasn't the golden brother too. So you destroyed someone else's life instead," Daniel said, the words landing with quiet, devastating precision. "An innocent woman lost her career, her reputation, 2 years of her life because you were too afraid to admit you'd made a mistake." Marcus had no answer for that, his jaw working silently. And for a long moment the kitchen held nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the weight of a family fracturing quietly in real time. "What happens now?" Marcus finally asked, his voice small in a way Daniel hadn't heard since they were children, and the question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them wanted to voice directly. Daniel had spent the better part of 3 sleepless days deciding exactly this, weighing loyalty to blood against responsibility to the truth. And though the decision had cost him more than he expected, he had arrived at it with a clarity that surprised him.
"You're going to resign from the board effective immediately," Daniel said. "You're going to repay every cent of what you took with whatever assets you have to liquidate to do it. And you're going to sit down with our legal team and cooperate fully with clearing Reina's name publicly if that's what it takes, because this isn't something we're going to quietly fix behind closed doors anymore."
"And if I don't?" Marcus asked, some flicker of his old defiance surfacing briefly.
"Then I turn everything over to the board and to the authorities, and you can explain the casino statements to them instead of me," Daniel said, and there was no threat in his voice, only exhaustion and a terrible, settled finality. "I'm not protecting you from this anymore, Marcus. I already protected the wrong person once, and it cost someone everything. I won't do it twice." Marcus left an hour later, quieter than Daniel had ever seen him, the folder of evidence still sitting on the kitchen island long after the door closed behind him, and Daniel sat alone in the silence that followed. Feeling no particular satisfaction in what he'd just done, only a bone-deep exhaustion, and the knowledge that the harder conversation, the one with Reina, still lay ahead of him, and would require something he wasn't entirely sure how to offer. Proof not just of his brother's guilt, but of his own willingness to actually see the damage his inattention had caused, rather than simply managing it from a comfortable distance. He went to the diner the next afternoon, not in disguise this time, walking in wearing an ordinary suit, without the baseball cap or the borrowed anonymity he'd hidden behind for weeks, because whatever came next needed to happen honestly, or not at all. Reina spotted him the moment he walked through the door, her expression hardening instantly, and she turned to the shift manager beside her rather than approaching the counter herself.
"I don't want to talk to him," she said.
Not quietly enough to avoid Daniel hearing every word, and the manager visibly uncomfortable at the prospect of mediating between an employee and the company's CEO, glanced between them with obvious panic. "Please," Daniel said, staying near the entrance rather than crowding the counter, giving her space, even though every instinct told him to close the distance immediately. "5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. After that, if you want me gone, I'll go, and I won't come back unless you ask me to." Reina's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he thought she would refuse outright, but something in his tone, or perhaps simple curiosity about what could possibly justify his return, made her nod once, sharply, gesturing toward a booth in the back corner, away from the other customers. She sat across from him with her arms crossed, every line of her posture guarded, and Daniel slid the folder across the table, the same one he'd shown Marcus the night before, minus the casino statements, which he decided belonged in a legal proceeding rather than this conversation. "I found your emails," he said quietly. "The ones you sent to compliance about the vendor discrepancies months before you were terminated. You weren't the one who falsified those accounts, Reina. You're the one who caught it." Reina went very still, her eyes moving over the pages he'd placed in front of her with an expression Daniel couldn't fully read, something between disbelief and a grief so old it had calcified into numbness. "I know," she said finally, her voice flat. "I've known for 2 years. Nobody believed me. Or nobody wanted to believe me, which amounts to the same thing when you're the one without the power to prove it." "My brother did it," Daniel said. "He redirected the investigation to protect himself, and I signed off on your termination without ever reading past the summary he handed me. I'm not telling you this to excuse it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know exactly what happened And because I'm going to fix it publicly, whether or not you ever want to speak to me again after this. Raina's hands resting on the table curled slightly. And when she finally looked up at him, her eyes were bright with an anger that had clearly been suppressed for 2 long, silent years, finally given somewhere to land. "Do you have any idea what those 2 years cost me?" she asked, her voice shaking now, the careful composure she'd maintained through every diner shift finally cracking under the weight of being heard. "I couldn't get hired anywhere in finance with a termination for fraud on my record. I lost my apartment. I moved back in with my sister for 8 months because I couldn't make rent on a cashier's wage. I applied to 43 jobs, Daniel 43, and either got rejected outright or ghosted the second a background check came back. And the entire time I knew the truth, and nobody with any power cared enough to check." Daniel absorbed each word without flinching, though every one landed like a blow he knew he deserved. "You're right," he said simply. "And I can't give you those 2 years back. But I can clear your name completely publicly with the company's full resources behind it. And I can make sure Marcus faces real consequences instead of a quiet resignation nobody notices. And if you want compensation for what those 2 years cost you financially, professionally, I'll make sure you get it, not as charity, but as what you're actually owed." Raina wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, angry at herself for the tears more than anything Daniel had said. And for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring down at the folder as though it might rearrange itself into something less complicated. "I don't know if I can trust anything you're telling me," she said eventually, her voice quieter now, worn down rather than sharp. "You lied to me for 2 weeks. Even if everything in this folder is true, how do I know you're not just managing another crisis, the way you probably manage everything else?" It was a fair question, and Daniel took a moment before answering, wanting to give her something honest rather than something reassuring. "You don't know that," he admitted. "Not yet. I can't prove intentions with a folder of documents. All I can do is follow through on what I just told you, and let you watch whether I actually do it. I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm asking you to give me the chance to earn it, however long that takes." Raina studied him for a long, silent moment, the anger in her expression settling into something more complicated. Wary, but no longer entirely closed. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier hardness, replaced by a tired, cautious honesty. "Fix it first," she said. "Publicly, completely, no half measures. Then we'll talk about whether there's anything else worth talking about." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to trust. But it was a door left open rather than slammed shut. And as Daniel walked out of the diner that afternoon, he understood that whatever came next would have to be earned in full. One honest action at a time, with no shortcuts, and no more secrets standing between them. The press conference took place 11 days later in the same glass-walled auditorium at Cross Hospitality Group headquarters, where Daniel had announced quarterly earnings and new store openings dozens of times before. Except this time, the room felt different, charged with an anticipation that had nothing to do with stock prices. Word had leaked, as it always did in industries built on gossip and ambition, that something significant was coming from the CEO's office. And the seats were filled not just with the usual trade reporters, but with a handful of larger outlets that had caught wind of an internal scandal involving executive misconduct. Daniel stood backstage for a moment before walking out, running through the speech he'd drafted and redrafted for days, though he suspected no amount of preparation could make the next 20 minutes feel comfortable. Beside him, his general counsel reviewed the legal language one final time, cautioning him. Not for the first time, that full public disclosure of Marcus's actions carried real reputational and legal risk for the company. I understand the risk, Daniel said, adjusting his cuff with hands that were, for the first time in a very long professional career, faintly unsteady. I'm doing it anyway. He walked out to a wall of camera flashes and took his place behind the podium, scanning the room briefly before beginning. And though he hadn't told her he was doing this today, he found himself hoping foolishly that Raina might somehow be watching.
2 years ago, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the nerves beneath it. An employee of this company identified a pattern of financial irregularities and reported them through the proper internal channels.
Exactly as she was trained to do. Exactly as any of us would hope an employee would do if they discovered wrongdoing. Instead of being protected for doing the right thing, she was blamed for the very fraud she uncovered, terminated on falsified grounds, and left to rebuild her career and her life without any acknowledgement of what had actually happened to her. He paused, letting the weight of that land across the room, watching pens move rapidly across notepads and phones tilt slightly upward to catch better audio. That employee's name is Raina Cole. The fraud was committed by a senior executive of this company who used his position to redirect an internal investigation and protect himself at her expense. As of this morning, that executive has resigned from his position and from the board of directors has agreed to full financial restitution and is cooperating with an independent investigation whose findings will be made public in full. I signed off on Ms. Cole's termination 2 years ago without adequately reviewing the case against her. A failure of diligence I take full personal responsibility for, regardless of the personal circumstances that contributed to that failure. He didn't name Marcus outright in that first sentence, but legal had already prepared a supplementary statement with the details, and reporters would have the name within the hour regardless. What mattered more to Daniel standing there under the lights was the next part. Miss Cole's record has been fully and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing, effective immediately, with formal documentation provided to any employer or institution that requires it, he continued. She has been offered full reinstatement at her previous seniority level, along with financial compensation for the 2 years of lost income and professional opportunity this company's failure cost her. I want to be clear that this isn't charity, and it isn't simply corporate liability management dressed up as an apology. It's what she is owed, and it is long overdue. He fielded questions for another 20 minutes after that, some pointed, some skeptical one, particularly aggressive reporter pressing him on whether the timing of the disclosure was calculated to preempt an embarrassing leak rather than genuine accountability. A question Daniel answered honestly by admitting he couldn't fully separate his motives from each other. That guilt and responsibility, and yes, some awareness of optics, had all played a role, because he wasn't interested in pretending to a purity of motive he didn't actually possess. By the time he stepped off the stage, his shirt clinging slightly to his back despite the auditorium's air conditioning, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. Though he knew the hardest part of this particular reckoning still lay ahead of him, waiting behind a diner counter 3 miles away. He didn't go to her immediately. He understood with a clarity that had cost him considerable self-restraint to earn, that showing up at her workplace the same afternoon as a public press conference would look exactly like what she'd accused him of during their last real conversation. Another crisis being managed rather than a genuine reckoning being honored. Instead, he waited 2 full days, giving the story time to circulate, giving her time to see the coverage on her own terms, rather than through him standing in front of her, demanding acknowledgement for what he'd done. When he finally returned to the diner on the 3rd evening, he came without a disguise, without an agenda beyond simply being present, and he took a seat at the counter rather than a booth. The same stool he'd sat in during that first awkward, revealing conversation weeks earlier. Raina was there, though she'd been reinstated to her old position at corporate that same week and technically no longer needed the diner shift.
a fact her manager had mentioned to Daniel with obvious confusion when he'd asked why she was still on the schedule. She looked up when the bell chimed, and her expression, rather than hardening the way it had during his last unwanted visit, went carefully neutral, unreadable in a way that told him she hadn't yet decided how this particular conversation would go.
"I saw the press conference," she said, before he'd even fully settled onto the stool, her voice giving nothing away. "The whole company saw the press conference. It's been playing on a loop in the break room since Tuesday."
"I meant every word of him," Daniel said simply. "Not for the cameras. For you." Raina studied him for a long moment, wiping down a spot on the counter that didn't particularly need wiping. A small, nervous habit he'd noticed she reached for whenever a conversation moved somewhere she wasn't fully prepared to go. "Marcus resigned," she said eventually. "Legal called me yesterday. Full restitution. Formal apology. My old title back with back pay. It's more than I ever thought I'd actually get. I spent 2 years assuming I'd just have to live with what happened, because that's usually how it goes when you're the small person up against a company with more lawyers than I could ever afford. You shouldn't have had to fight for any of it," Daniel said. "It should have been done right the first time before there was ever a reason for you to fight." "But it wasn't," Raina said, not unkindly, just factually, the observation of someone who had learned painfully not to soften hard truths for other people's comfort. "And no amount of public statements changes the 2 years I actually lived through while everyone who could have fixed it chose not to look closely enough." Daniel absorbed that without arguing, because arguing would have missed the point entirely, and instead he simply nodded, letting the silence stretch between them, rather than filling it with justification she'd already told him she didn't want. "I'm not asking you to pretend those 2 years didn't happen," he said finally. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me, exactly. I know that's not something I get to request on a timeline that's convenient for me. I just wanted you to know that everything I said publicly was true, and that whatever happens between us personally, professionally, you're going to be fully taken care of, permanently, regardless of anything else." Raina's expression softened slightly at that, though wariness still lingered beneath it. An old defensive instinct that 2 weeks of kindness clearly hadn't been enough to fully dismantle. "Why do you keep coming back here?" she asked, and the question sounded genuinely curious rather than accusatory this time. "You could have sent a lawyer with paperwork. You could have handled all of this through HR and never had to sit at this counter again. Why does it matter to you whether I personally forgive you or not?" Daniel considered the question seriously, aware that his answer mattered more than almost anything he'd said in that press conference 2 days earlier. "Because somewhere in the last few weeks, before I knew any of this, before I even knew your last name, I started actually wanting to know you," he said. "Not the version of you dealing with a company that wronged you. Just you. The woman who gave my daughter apple slices because she noticed she was having a rough night. The woman who chased down a guy trying to skip out on a burger with nothing but sheer stubbornness. I don't know how to separate wanting to fix what my company did to you from just wanting to be around you, and I'm not going to pretend those two things aren't tangled together. But the second one is real too, whatever you decide to do with the first." Raina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing an idle pattern against the counter's edge, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost most of its earlier guardedness, replaced by something more tired and more honest. "I liked you before I knew who you were," she admitted, the words seeming to cost her something to say out loud. "That's the part that actually made me angriest, if I'm honest. Not just that you lied about your identity, but that I'd let myself start liking a stranger in a diner, and then found out the stranger was the person responsible for the worst 2 years of my life. It felt like a cruel joke." "It wasn't a joke," Daniel said quietly. "It was a mistake. A bad one.
and I understand if it's one you can't get past. But it wasn't cruelty. I didn't know who you were either, not until it was already too late to tell you gently. Raina nodded slowly, something in her posture finally loosening.
The rigid defensiveness she'd carried since the moment his badge had slipped out of that jacket pocket, softening into simple exhaustion. The kind that comes after carrying anger for far too long without anywhere useful to put it down.
I don't know what I want yet, she said honestly. I want to believe the last few weeks meant something real. But I also spent 2 years learning not to trust powerful people who say the right things.
And I don't know how to just switch that off because you gave a good speech. You don't have to switch it off, Daniel said. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to push you toward anything faster than you're ready for. I just didn't want you to spend one more day thinking I saw those weeks as nothing. He didn't stay much longer after that, sensing correctly that the conversation had reached the edge of what she could handle in one sitting, and he left with nothing resolved, beyond an agreement unspoken but understood that the door between them remained open rather than closed, even if neither of them yet knew what walking through it might look like. Over the following weeks, he didn't push. He sent nothing extravagant, made no grand romantic gestures designed for an audience, understanding that whatever trust might eventually rebuild between them would have to be built in ordinary, unremarkable moments rather than sweeping ones. He simply showed up occasionally, without pressure, sometimes with Lily in tow when his daughter specifically requested the diner with the purple crayon lady, a nickname that made Raina laugh for the first time in his presence since the truth had come out. A small, unguarded sound that Daniel found himself thinking about for days afterward. It was Lily, in the end, who did more to bridge the distance than Daniel's careful patience managed on its own. On a Saturday afternoon, nearly a month after the press conference, Raina, now fully reinstated in her old compliance role, and only occasionally covering diner shifts out of what she claimed was simple habit rather than any lingering attachment, ran into Daniel and Lily at the small neighborhood park near her apartment, an entirely unplanned collision that neither of them had orchestrated. Lily, delighted at the unexpected reunion, immediately launched into a detailed update on the ongoing saga of the Purple Dragon Diner, insisting Raina settle a dispute about whether dragons could eat pancakes for dinner, a question Raina answered with the same careful seriousness she'd once applied to color-coded financial reports. Daniel watched the two of them from a nearby bench, something in his chest loosening at the easy, natural warmth between them. And when Raina eventually settled beside him while Lily ran off toward the swings, the silence between the adults felt different than it had in weeks, less guarded, more like two people simply enjoying an ordinary afternoon. She talks about you a lot, Daniel said, nodding toward his daughter now hanging upside down from the monkey bars in a way that made his heart briefly stop. More than I expected, honestly. She's easy to like, Raina said, watching Lily with a soft expression she didn't seem aware she was wearing. Kids don't carry grudges the way adults do. It's kind of a relief, honestly, being around someone who just likes you for the apple slices and doesn't know or care about anything else. For what it's worth, Daniel said carefully. I don't just like you for the apple slices either. Raina glanced sideways at him, something wry and cautiously amused flickering across her face. That's a low bar to clear, Daniel. I'm aware, he said, allowing himself a small smile. I'm working my way up from there. They sat together for a while longer, watching Lily invent an increasingly elaborate game involving the swing set and an imaginary villain only she could see. And eventually, without any particular fanfare, Raina admitted quietly that she'd started to miss him during the weeks he'd deliberately kept his distance, an admission that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. I'm not saying I trust you completely, she clarified quickly before he could read too much into it.
I'm saying I don't hate the idea of finding out whether I could, eventually. If you keep doing what you've been doing, instead of just saying it.
It took another 2 months before anything between them solidified into something either of them was willing to name out loud. 2 months of dinners that started as coincidental and gradually became deliberate. Of Raina slowly opening up about her sister, her old ambitions in finance she'd once abandoned entirely out of self-protective necessity and was now, with her reputation restored, quietly considering pursuing again. Of Daniel learning to be less careful, less managed, in a relationship for the first time since his wife's death. Allowing himself vulnerability he'd spent 2 years locking away behind spreadsheets and board meetings. Marcus, for his part, completed his restitution and disappeared from the family business entirely, moving out of state to what Daniel understood through occasional strained phone calls was a slower and more private process of rebuilding a life stripped of the privilege he'd once taken for granted. Their relationship remained fractured, not beyond all hope of repair, but honest in a way it hadn't been in years, no longer built on the comfortable fiction that Marcus's mistakes were smaller or more forgivable simply because they shared a last name. On a warm evening nearly 6 months after that first accidental dinner at the diner, Daniel stood in his kitchen watching Raina help Lily construct an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, the two of them arguing cheerfully over the correct placement of a critical support pillow. And he felt something settle inside him that he hadn't fully expected to feel again after his wife's death. A sense that his life, badly broken in places, was nonetheless assembling itself into something whole and unexpectedly good. Raina had accepted a promotion within the company's compliance division the previous month, insisting on earning the position through interviews and qualifications rather than accepting anything that could be mistaken for favoritism, a boundary Daniel respected completely, even as it made him admire her more. She hadn't moved in, hadn't rushed toward any grand declarations. Neither of them was ready to make, but she was there consistently, in the small, unremarkable ways that mattered most, in blanket forts and dragon sagas, and quiet mornings that no longer felt like something either of them had to guard so carefully against. Later that night, after Lily had finally fallen asleep inside her triumphant fort, Raina found Daniel on the back porch, staring out at nothing in particular, and settled beside him with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over months of careful, deliberate honesty. "You're doing that thing again," she said, nudging his shoulder gently. "The thing where you disappear into your own head and forget I'm sitting right here." "Just thinking," Daniel admitted, "about how strange it is that the worst mistake I ever made turned into the reason I met you." Raina considered that for a moment, leaning her head against his shoulder with a comfort that had taken months to build and now felt entirely natural. "I used to think about it that way too for a while," she said. "Like some cosmic trade-off, 2 years of misery in exchange for eventually ending up here. But I don't think it actually works like that. I think you made a mistake, a real one, with real consequences. And separately, you happen to also be a decent person underneath the mistake. And eventually, the decent person showed up and did the work to fix what he'd broken. Those are 2 different things. I don't owe the mistake anything for bringing us together. I just happen to like what came after it." Daniel turned to look at her, something warm and grateful moving through him at the particular clarity of her honesty, the same directness that had first caught his attention behind a diner counter months earlier, offering apple slices to a stranger's daughter without expecting anything in return. "I don't deserve you being this generous about it," he said quietly. "Probably not," Raina agreed, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "But I've decided I'm not really interested in keeping score anymore.
I spent 2 years doing nothing but keeping score, cataloging every unfairness.
Every person who let me down. It didn't get me anything, except tired. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his with quiet certainty. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything, more content simply to sit together in the warm evening air. Two people who had found each other through circumstances neither would have chosen, building something new and deliberate out of what remained. Inside the house, the blanket fort held steady in the darkened living room, a small monument to ordinary joy. And somewhere beyond the porch railing, the city lights of the company Daniel had spent his life building glittered faintly against the horizon, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong, and everything he was now determined to do better because of it. He didn't know exactly what the future held, whether Raina would eventually decide to fully trust him, Whether Lily would one day ask difficult questions about how her father and the purple crayon lady had actually met, whether Marcus would ever find his way back into something resembling family. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Cross found he wasn't managing a crisis or calculating an outcome. He was simply sitting on his own porch, holding the hand of a woman who had once fed his daughter apple slices without expecting anything in return, and letting himself believe cautiously but completely that some mistakes could still be turned with patience and honesty and enough time into something worth having.